Okay, let's talk about chapter 7. Even though this is a public speaking course and our emphasis is going to be on how to become a better speaker, listening is just as important. So, we're going to cover one chapter that's dedicated strictly to this. Okay, get started here. Okay, so often we take listening for granted. Many times when we're in a conversation, we're sometimes just waiting for our turn to talk. How many of you have ever been around somebody who is just genuinely present? Like you feel that they have their utmost attention on you. Those people are awesome listeners. And that's something that we need to all work on. We all can hear for the most part, but that's a passive act. Listening is far more intentional and involves critical thinking as well. So, listening is a conscious act of not only receiving these messages, but then processing them, comprehending them, interpreting them, evaluating them, and deciding how we're going to respond. So, because we're selective listeners, and I'm sure you're all guilty of that sitting through any lecture, these are some things we should keep in mind. When we're speaking, we have to offer something that's important to our listeners, show our listeners that whatever we have to say, they have something to gain from it. And whenever we can, try to connect with our listeners, with our audience. So you're far more likely to get engagement then. Okay, so how do we listen responsibly? Keep in mind that when we are giving speeches, it's so important that you are a good listener in that audience. The littlest things you can do can really rattle your speakers. So realize that listeners have power. They can be constructive, build you up with head nods and smiles, or they can be destructive by not paying attention to you, rolling your eyes, things like that. In addition, we need to be ethical as listeners. That means we need to refrain from anything that's disruptive or intimidating. Don't look at our phones, be engaged. So, what do you think? What behaviors or characteristics mark a good listener? If you think about people that you really enjoy having a one on one conversation with because you feel that they are at their utmost very engaged and present, what are some of those qualities? What does a good listener do to make you aware that they are fully present and engaged? Just something to think about, things that we need to emulate. Listening is indeed very complex. We take it for granted, but it involves so many different layers of cognition. It involves sensing, interpreting, evaluating, remembering, thinking, and so much more. So, we need to work to become better listeners. Unfortunately, in our culture right now, with everything that we're bombarded with all of the time, I think our culture works against these abilities. You have so many different things coming at you at the same time. Even when you're watching a movie or a TV show or YouTube videos, you're getting messages from multiple sources, especially with our devices. Unfortunately, educational expectations have been dumbed down over the years, and we don't make students work as hard at listening. Plus, there's constant propaganda, which also causes us to tune out. Sometimes, because of that propaganda, we struggle with distinguishing between facts and opinions, facts and beliefs. And many of us think we're really good at multitasking. We're not. Don't delude yourself. We all need to work harder at becoming better listeners. The most important thing we can do is become better at communicating face to face. So, what can you do to practice active listening? It's important that as a listener, you're giving feedback, whether that's oral comments, applause, or just great head nods and eye contact. Make sure that you're giving that speaker support. Be aware that a lot of us fall into pseudo listening, and you're probably guilty of this and sitting in other classes as well, where it looks like you're actively listening. You know how to play the game, nod, smile, make eye contact, but your attention and focus is not there. So work hard at being fully present. As a listener, it's important when you do offer feedback to be honest and fair. We have to adjust. Everybody's speaking style is going to be a little bit different. Be compassionate. One of the things that's good about a speech class is learning how to take constructive criticism. Be selective in your criticism. Don't bombard anybody with a ton of different things that they all need to work on. Focus on one or two things. So, some of the functions of listening. Obviously, one of the main things we do is listen to learn, to get more information. Sometimes we listen to also form opinions, to evaluate. It's really important that we listen with empathy, that we listen to understand and connect with other people. So when we're listening for empathy, sometimes it's important to do some perception checking. Like, what I'm hearing is, or did you mean? And you just kind of connect more that way. And then obviously, think about your music or anything like that. We listen for enjoyment too. Some of the barriers that get in the way, sometimes we just aren't interested. The topic's boring to us, or maybe we're critical of the speaker, him or herself. Sometimes we are too nitpicky as a listener and we focus on too many details instead of the whole concept. Listening is hard work. So sometimes we're in challenging situations, or maybe the time period is far too long and it makes it really hard to listen. And other times we just fail to ignore or adjust to distractions, maybe the way a speaker looks, things like that, that we are, unfortunately, as human beings, very judgmental. And then, as we mentioned before with the pseudo listening, sometimes we just fake attention. And we sometimes also are guilty of letting our own personal bias and prejudice serve as major barriers to effective listening. Okay, so we all need to become critical listeners. So a critical listener judges the accuracy, the content, and determines whether it's reasonable and makes evaluations based on that. Critical listeners have to also be critical thinkers. So you have to be able to analyze and assess, evaluate that information. We should always be listening, thinking, and even questioning what we hear. We need to grow as consumers of information and work hard that we get better at differentiating between fact and opinion, especially in this era. We all can get better. So the biggest communication problem is that we don't listen to understand. Unfortunately, we listen to reply. Okay, that's a quick summary of chapter 7. We'll get you more information on the preceding chapters here in just a moment. And close this out.